Night falls over the Baltic, but the lights flicker unevenly. Apartment blocks stand half dark. Factories hum, then fall silent. Along quiet streets, suitcases are dragged toward waiting cars, and train platforms echo with departures that feel permanent. What happens when a fortress begins to empty from the inside? When a territory built to project power starts losing the very people meant to sustain it? Kaliningrad, once described by Western planners as one of the most militarized pieces of land in Europe, is no longer defined solely by missiles, radars, and concrete bunkers. It is now defined by absence, by missing workers, missing families, and missing confidence. For decades, Kaliningrad was portrayed by Moscow as a strategic jewel. Carved out of the ruins of Königsberg after World War II, the exclave became Russia's westernmost bastion, wedged between NATO members Poland and Lithuania. It bristled with Iskander missiles, S-400 air defenses, and naval assets meant to dominate the Baltic Sea. In Kremlin, messaging Kaliningrad was untouchable, a warning shot aimed permanently at Europe. Yet beneath that hardened exterior fragility was quietly taking root. That fragility accelerated after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Sanctions did not merely punish Moscow symbolically, they exposed the unique vulnerability of an isolated region cut off from its mainland lifelines. Kaliningrad depends on transit through foreign territory or maritime routes controlled and monitored by others. When pressure-mounted geography stopped being an advantage and became a trap, what had once been a forward-operating fortress began to resemble an island under siege, not by bombs, but by economic and demography. Early warning signs emerged in the labor market. Unemployment surged at a pace unseen in the region's post-Soviet history. Official statistics painted a cautious picture, but independent surveys and academic studies pointed to a deeper rot. Factories slowed as inputs failed to arrive on time. Construction projects stalled, leaving cranes frozen over half-finished buildings. Service sector jobs vanished as purchasing power collapsed. This was not a cyclical downturn, it was systemic erosion. The human dimension made the shift impossible to ignore. Those most affected were not marginal workers, but experienced professionals, accountants, managers, economists, people who had anchored the region's middle class. Women over 40 were disproportionately pushed out of work, facing months without income in a job market offering fewer and fewer openings. The average time to find employment doubled, forcing families to survive on shrinking benefits while costs rose. Kaliningrad's social contract began to fracture. Strategically, this mattered far beyond economics. Military power does not exist in a vacuum. Missiles require technicians. Bases require logistics. Cities near garrisons require functioning civilian economies. As unemployment climbed and frustration deepened, Kaliningrad's image as a reliable stronghold started to collapse under its own weight. The fortress was still standing, but the foundations were weakening from within. This was the opening chapter of a much larger story. A story not only about one region, but about how modern power erodes when pressure is applied simultaneously to supply lines, labor markets, and human confidence. And the question lingered in the cold Baltic air: if Kaliningrad could begin to hollow out like this, what did that say about the durability of the system that built it? The collapse did not arrive with explosions or sirens. It arrived on spreadsheets, shipping manifests, and empty loading docks. When European Union sanctions tightened, Kaliningrad felt the impact faster and harder than almost any other Russian region. Its economy had always relied on uninterrupted transit rail and road corridors through Lithuania and Poland, supplemented by predictable maritime flows. Once those arteries were constricted, the region's economic bloodstream began to fail. What followed was not chaos, but paralysis. Moscow promised adaptation. Road and rail would be replaced by maritime supply routes, officials said. Ships would compensate for sanctions. Ports would scale up. Reality proved far harsher. Open source shipping data and port activity reports revealed a system overwhelmed almost immediately. Hundreds of trucks piled up at Ust-Luga, some sitting idle for weeks, even months. Drivers abandoned cargo in unsecured lots, walking away from deliveries that no longer made economic sense. Maritime transport, far from being a solution, became another bottleneck. For an import-dependent region like Kaliningrad, delays were devastating. Construction materials such as cement and metal arrived late or not at all. Industrial plants dependent on just-in-time deliveries slowed production or shut down entire lines. Ports themselves became choke points, unable to process erratic flows of cargo. Each delay rippled outward, factories cut shifts, contractors canceled projects, and suppliers laid off workers. This was how sanctions translated into unemployment, not as an abstract policy, but as a daily lived reality. The labor market told the story with brutal clarity. In Kaliningrad, city vacancies briefly outnumbered job seekers, masking the deeper imbalance. In rural eastern districts like Slavsk and Ozersk, competition reversed sharply with multiple applicants chasing each available position. Vulnerable communities absorbed the shock first. Skilled white-collar workers found their expertise suddenly irrelevant in an economy stripped of investment and growth. The decline in advertised vacancies, nearly 9% over 10 months, signaled that recovery was not around the corner. This economic suffocation carried strategic implications. Kaliningrad's military value depends on its ability to sustain itself in crisis. Yet sanctions demonstrated that the region could be strangled without a single shot fired. Every delayed shipment weakened readiness. Every closed factory reduced the civilian backbone supporting military infrastructure. The balance between security and economic freedom tilted sharply, exposing a fundamental contradiction. A fortress that cannot function economically becomes a liability, not an asset. Globally, the pattern was familiar. Ukraine's blockade of Russian logistics, Red Sea disruptions affecting global trade, even US-China tensions over semiconductor supply chains all showed how modern conflict targets flow rather than territory. Kaliningrad became a case study in this new reality. Power was no longer contested solely with tanks and missiles, but with insurance policies, port access, and transit permissions. As unemployment climbed and frustration spread, public confidence eroded. People began asking questions Moscow could not easily answer. How secure is a region that cannot feed its industries? How sovereign is a territory dependent on adversaries for access? Kaliningrad's crisis revealed that sanctions, when aligned with geography, can do what armies sometimes cannot: quietly dismantle the foundations of power. And as the docks remained crowded with undelivered cargo, another process was already underway, one far more difficult to reverse. When economies collapse, people leave. When uncertainty becomes permanent, the most capable leave first. In Kaliningrad, this pattern unfolded with chilling speed. The departures were not chaotic panics, but calculated decisions made by those with skills, education, and options. Suitcases belong not only to laborers, but to entrepreneurs, freelancers, and professionals in their prime. The region's future was walking out the door. Between 2022 and 2025, estimates suggested that tens of thousands, possibly as many as 150,000 residents left the exclave. Official statistics remained conspicuously quiet. Monthly demographic data disappeared from public releases, feeding suspicion that the true scale of the exodus was being concealed. Independent sociological studies filled the gap, painting a consistent picture. The migrants were disproportionately young, educated, and economically active. These were not excess mouths to feed. They were the region's human capital. The motivations extended beyond economics. Kaliningrad's geography, once a strategic selling point, became a source of anxiety. Living between two NATO states, residents increasingly viewed the region as a potential front line rather than a protected rear area. Military exercises, electronic warfare incidents, and constant talk of escalation transformed daily life into a background hum of risk. Parents asked whether raising children here made sense. Professionals questioned whether investing their futures in a possible battlefield was rational. This local flight intersected with a national crisis. Russia's demographic decline, worsened by war casualties, and emigration reached a point where even official agencies curtailed transparency. Analysts at institutions such as the Institute for the Study of War pointed to data blackouts as evidence of systemic strain. Each young engineer or IT specialist leaving Kaliningrad represented more than a personal choice. It was a subtraction from Russia's long-term economic and military capacity. The human impact was visible in quieter streets and shuttered businesses. Schools consolidated classes. Small firms closed as client bases shrank. Social networks fractured as families split across borders and regions. For those left behind, the sense of abandonment grew. The state promised resilience, but resilience felt abstract when neighbors vanished and opportunities dried up. Strategically, this brain drain carried consequences as severe as any weapons loss. Modern militaries rely on technical expertise, logistics management, and innovation ecosystems. Kaliningrad was bleeding precisely the demographic needed to maintain sophisticated systems, from air defense networks to communications hubs. A fortress without people becomes a shell, impressive on satellite imagery, but hollow in reality. Similar patterns echoed globally. Ukraine experienced displacement under fire, Israel faced talent concerns amid prolonged conflict, and China confronted capital and human flight during economic slowdowns. In each case, security and freedom pulled in opposite directions. Kaliningrad demonstrated what happens when the balance breaks. Security rhetoric accelerates the very instability it seeks to prevent. By the time authorities acknowledged the scale of departures, momentum was already against them. Migration feeds on itself. Those who leave send signals back home, confirming fears and lowering the psychological cost of departure. Kaliningrad was no longer just losing population, it was losing faith. And as people exited, another lifeline snapped, tightening the noose around the exclave's future. The economic pressure reached a breaking point when energy flows were disrupted. Lithuania's decision to halt the rail transit of Lukoil cargoes into Kaliningrad was not merely a regulatory adjustment, it was a strategic shock. Nearly all oil shipments passing through Lithuanian territory had sustained the exclave's energy needs. When that flow stopped, Moscow's vulnerability was exposed in stark terms. A region built to intimidate NATO suddenly depended on the goodwill of NATO states for fuel. This was not an isolated move. Lithuania acted in anticipation of expanding Western sanctions and the risk of secondary penalties. From a Baltic perspective, it was defensive compliance. From Moscow's perspective, it was economic strangulation. Oil, unlike consumer goods, cannot be easily rerouted without cost. Storage limits, port capacity, and insurance restrictions compounded the problem. Supplies tightened, prices rose. Industrial planning became guesswork. The implications rippled outward. Energy insecurity undermined industrial output already weakened by logistical failures. It also carried symbolic weight. Kaliningrad had long hosted critical military infrastructure precisely because it was assumed to be self-sustaining in crisis. The oil disruption proved otherwise. If fuel could be cut, so could other essentials. The myth of autonomy dissolved. Globally, similar choke points defined modern power struggles. Iran faced energy export constraints through maritime enforcement. Ukraine targeted Russian refineries to erode battlefield endurance. US-China rivalry centered on semiconductor access rather than territory. In each case, control over flows mattered more than control over land. Kaliningrad's isolation turned it into a textbook example of this shift. The psychological impact was profound. Businesses hesitated to invest. Residents questioned whether basic services could be guaranteed in an emergency. Military planners had to factor civilian fragility into operational readiness. A fortress reliant on external transit is only as strong as the weakest link in its supply chain, and Kaliningrad had many. This energy choke point also revealed something deeper about power projection. Strategic prestige depends on credibility. When adversaries demonstrate they can apply pressure without firing a shot, deterrence erodes. Kaliningrad's energy crisis signaled that Russia's control over the Baltic environment was no longer decisive. As fuel shortages loomed and transit routes narrowed, attention shifted from economics to security. The question was no longer whether Kaliningrad could thrive, but whether it could be defended at all. Economic weakness rarely remains isolated for long. In Kaliningrad, it quickly translated into military vulnerability. As supply chains frayed and the population thinned, NATO's posture toward the exclave hardened. Statements that once sounded hypothetical turned explicit. Senior Polish commanders publicly declared that Kaliningrad would no longer be treated as a sanctuary in a future conflict. The language was blunt, deliberate, and designed to be heard in Moscow. General Yaroslav Gromyzhinsky's warning cut through years of strategic ambiguity. The message was unmistakable. If escalation came, Kaliningrad would be neutralized decisively. The threat was not framed as conquest, but as denial, burning, blinding, and isolating the exclave until it ceased to function as a military node. This reflected a broader NATO doctrine shift, one shaped by lessons from Ukraine. Static fortresses, no matter how heavily armed, are liabilities when cut off from reinforcement and resupply. On the ground, posture matched rhetoric. Poland reinforced its northeastern flank, reportedly concentrating tens of thousands of troops near the border. Germany expanded its forward presence, signaling alliance cohesion and long-term commitment. Electronic warfare incidents increased. GPS disruptions and navigation interference around the Baltic constrained Russian military operations, degrading precision and situational awareness. Kaliningrad was being left blind and deaf. Russia's response was revealing. Instead of reinforcing the exclave, reports indicated a drawdown. Personnel were redeployed eastward where losses in Ukraine demanded replacements. Strategically, this was triage. Moscow was sacrificing depth in the Baltic to sustain the war elsewhere, but the decision carried consequences. Each unit withdrawn reduced deterrence and amplified the perception of retreat. This pattern echoed globally. Israel's emphasis on rapid dominance over protracted defense, Iran's reliance on proxy depth rather than fixed positions, and US-China wargaming around island chains all pointed to the same conclusion: isolated strongholds invite pressure. Kaliningrad, once a symbol of Russia's ability to project power westward, became an example of how geography can reverse advantage. For residents, the military shift reinforced fears that had already driven migration. The presence of troops reassures only when stability feels permanent. When forces leave, an adversary's posture, reassurance turns to alarm. Civilian life and military strategy collided, each amplifying the other's stress. The exclave's transformation was now unmistakable. Economic collapse opened the door. Demographic flight widened it. Military pressure pushed it fully ajar. Kaliningrad was no longer a shield on Russia's frontier. It was a pressure point, one that adversaries understood and one Moscow struggled to defend. And with that realization, the exclave's role in Russia's grand strategy entered its most uncertain phase yet. What remains when a fortress loses its people, its supply lines, and its strategic certainty? Kaliningrad now stands as a stark answer. Once marketed by the Kremlin as an impregnable bastion anchoring Russia's dominance in the Baltic, the exclave has become a symbol of strategic overreach. Heavily armed yet structurally fragile, feared in theory but vulnerable in practice, geography once exploited for leverage has turned ruthless. Russian military planners long understood the paradox. Academic assessments and wargaming exercises quietly acknowledged that in a major NATO conflict, Kaliningrad would be cut off within days. Supplies would dwindle, reinforcements would be impossible. What sustained the illusion was confidence that deterrence would prevent such a scenario from ever materializing. That confidence has eroded, not because war has come to Kaliningrad, but because pressure already has. The region's decline exposes a deeper failure in Russia's security doctrine. For 25 years, power was built on the promise of control over territory, over populations, over escalation. Kaliningrad was central to that narrative. Iskander missiles and S-400 systems were not only weapons, they were symbols. Today, those symbols stand amid rising unemployment, demographic flight, and shrinking logistics. A fortress cannot deter when its interior is emptying. Globally, the lesson resonates. Ukraine showed how logistics decide wars. Israel and Iran demonstrate how escalation avoidance competes with domestic stability. The United States and China measure power increasingly through access, resilience, and alliances rather than sheer force. In this environment, strategic prestige depends on sustainability. Kaliningrad fails that test. The human cost underscores the point. Families leaving, careers abandoned, futures redirected elsewhere. Every departure reduces not only economic output, but also legitimacy. Security that demands sacrifice without stability eventually collapses under its own weight. Kaliningrad's fading lights are not just an economic indicator, they are a referendum on governance under pressure. As NATO consolidates its presence and Russia reallocates its forces, the exclave's fate remains unresolved. It may persist as a militarized outpost, or fade into irrelevance, or become a bargaining chip in a future negotiation. But one reality is already clear: the promise that Kaliningrad represented a guarantee of dominance through force has been broken. And that raises a final unsettling question. If one of Russia's most fortified regions can be hollowed out without a single invading army, what does that mean for power in an age where borders matter less than flows, people, and confidence? Kaliningrad's crisis is not an isolated regional story. It is a case study in modern power erosion. Sanctions and geography combined to strangle supply lines, triggering unemployment and industrial paralysis. Economic stress accelerated demographic flight, draining the region of young educated talent essential for long-term stability. Energy disruptions exposed dependence on adversaries, while NATO pressure revealed the military limits of an isolated fortress. Together, these forces transformed Kaliningrad from a symbol of Russian strength into a strategic liability. The exclave demonstrates how security without economic resilience collapses, how deterrence fails when credibility erodes, and how human confidence matters as much as hardware. Similar dynamics appear globally, from Ukraine to the Middle East to US-China rivalry, where control over flows increasingly outweighs control over territory. Kaliningrad now stands as a warning. Power built on fear alone is brittle. When people leave, logistics fail, and allies consolidate, even the strongest fortresses can hollow out from within. The future of Kaliningrad remains uncertain, but its lesson is already written in the modern world. Strength is sustained not by walls and missiles, but by resilience, legitimacy, and the ability to keep societies functioning under pressure.